Today, we're about to attempt what Bugatti think is impossible. Here is the front of a Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport, and here is the rear half of a Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport, and today, we've got to connect both of them together. Oh no! Oh no!
So if you watched part 1, you know exactly where we left off. Matt Armstrong had gotten himself into what was already one of the most talked about rebuild projects YouTube had ever seen. A wrecked Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport, one of only 60 ever made, sitting in a Miami workshop with a smashed front end and a brand that had basically come out publicly and said this car should not be rebuilt outside of their own factory. Mate Rimac himself weighed in.
And if you want to repair that properly, you can't just do that in a garage.
The whole thing had turned into this massive back and forth between a YouTuber with a spanner and one of the most exclusive car manufacturers on the planet. And then right at the end of part 1, just when you thought the drama could not get any heavier, Matt found damage near the gearbox and engine mounting area that nobody really wanted to see. The kind of thing that makes you stare at it for a while, hoping it looks better the longer you look at it. It does not. So that is where we pick things up. And honestly, part 2 is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the Bugatti drama is still there in the background, but now the real question takes over. Can Matt actually do this? The car is in pieces, the parts situation is still a mess.
Oh, a Bugatti. Yeah. I don't have any Bugatti parts in inventory.
Yeah, that. Can we order?
But what's going to happen is with Bugatti, when I order parts, we physically have to have a vehicle in the shop.
And at this point, proving a point means nothing if the work does not actually hold up. Whatever happens next has to be real progress, and that is what we are getting into today. So Matt dropped episode 3 on February 8th, 2026, and it hit 12 million views almost immediately. After mate Rimac had gone on record saying that properly separating a Chiron required specialized equipment, special training, and a controlled environment.
Just a few places in the world with the right equipment and only a few people in the world with the right training to be able to do that.
Matt essentially made an entire episode out of doing exactly that in what is very much not a controlled environment. He leans into that point hard too, framing the workshop as the so-called third place in the world, now capable of doing what Bugatti said only 2 places could do. The reason he had to go that far was straightforward though. The damage near the rear of the car was too serious to just work around. What had first looked like a bad crack in the gearbox area had turned into the single biggest question hanging over the whole project. And the only way to actually get a proper look at it was to pull the engine. On a Bugatti, that means separating the entire rear drivetrain section from the front carbon tub, which sounds like the kind of thing that should immediately end a YouTube rebuild series.
Now, one thing Bugatti didn't think we were able to do is separate the front end of the car from the rear. There's only 2 places in the world that can do it. And today, we need to make sure there's 3.
Matt treated it like a Tuesday. He, his dad, Alex, and the rest of the team just started taking the car apart piece by piece. Rear quarters off, door seals off, hidden bolts found behind trim. The rear hatch came off easier than expected, which Matt seemed almost personally offended by. The wing came off. The bumper came off as one giant assembly. Airboxes out. Wiring looms traced. Hydraulic lines carefully disconnected and saved, partly because they were not entirely sure what fluid was even in them or how difficult it would be to source later.
Coolant lines disconnected. We need to save as much fluid as we can. We need to know what fluid is coming out because Bugatti are not going to tell us.
The whole thing was half tear down and half archaeology dig. What stands out watching that episode is how often Matt sounds genuinely surprised the car is not more difficult to take apart. Not because the Chiron is not impressive, it obviously is, but because once the logic of how it is assembled starts making sense, the process becomes a lot less mysterious. By the end of it, he is basically admitting his went quicker than expected too.
Now it's going to be the hard part. This was the easy part.
What he thought might take all week was done in a couple of days, which only made the whole factory-only claim look even weaker. And that quietly undermines the whole idea that this car is untouchable outside of a factory setting. Matt never claims the Chiron is simple. His point is just that somebody built it, which means somebody else can take it apart. And then comes the moment that basically defines the whole episode. After disconnecting the wiring, coolant lines, hydraulic lines, prop shaft, fuel lines, and the 14 fasteners holding both halves of the car together, the Bugatti splits in two. The front tub and rear drivetrain section separate, with the front end sitting on what can only be described as some bin wheels, looking absolutely unhinged. It looked ridiculous. It also worked completely. The thing Bugatti said could not be done in a regular garage had just been done in a regular garage, with the front half of a Chiron Pur Sport resting on wheels that have absolutely no business being anywhere near a $2 million car. That moment shifted the whole conversation. Before it, plenty of people were still treating the rebuild like a stunt that would eventually run into a wall it could not climb. After it, even viewers who still agreed with Bugatti on the safety arguments had to admit Matt had cleared something genuinely significant. But splitting the car was never really the point. It was just the only way to see what was actually going on underneath, which on a crashed Bugatti is rarely good news. And what Matt found when the rear section came free was a mixed bag. The crash had pushed the engine forward hard enough to crush a coolant pipe and leave marks in places you really do not want to see marks on a $2 million car.
I think what's happened is the engine is shunted forward like that, and that's what's caused the crack.
But the thing that stood out most was the cast aluminum engine and gearbox mounting support. This was not some trim piece or cosmetic bracket that you could just glue back and hope for the best. This was a structural component carrying serious load, and it had broken on both sides in a way that suddenly made it very clear why the damage had looked so alarming when the car was still together. The good news, and genuinely nobody saw this coming, was that the damage appeared to be contained to that mounting support rather than going deeper into the engine block itself. If the engine block had taken the full hit directly, this video series would have been a lot shorter and a lot sadder. But Matt's read on it was that the broken piece was its own separate component.
And now we can find out whether that damaged part will unbolt separately.
Which meant it could potentially be repaired, remade, or worked around somehow. That changes everything. The story went from possibly having a destroyed Bugatti engine, which is the kind of sentence that makes accountants cry, to having one very serious broken part, with no way to order a replacement, because Bugatti still was not selling them anything. So by the end of that episode, the project had actually found something like a direction.
Good news is that we've now took off the last part of the car that's broken.
The worst of the damage was identified and off the car. The engine was looking more hopeful than anyone had dared to expect, and the next challenge at least had a shape to it, which is where Bob and Matt's fabricator become a really important part of the story. Because solving a problem like this without any factory support requires someone who can look at a broken structural part, decide whether the material is actually weldable, and then repair it with enough confidence that the entire engine and gearbox can hang off it again. So this is where the rebuild stops being about drama and starts being about actually fixing the thing. The car is in two halves, the broken mount is sitting on a workbench, and Matt has to figure out what to do with it without being able to call Bugatti and ask nicely for a replacement. He narrows it down to two options. The first is to 3D scan the broken mount and machine an entirely new one from billet aluminum, which sounds incredibly cool and is exactly the kind of thing that gets clicks. Stronger, cleaner, custom made from scratch. The problem is that the mount contains precise locations for crank position sensors, and if those sensor positions end up even slightly off, the engine could run badly, refuse to start, or do something unpredictable under boost.
Now, when they're making it out of the complete CNC machine block, if one of these crank sensors are not in the exact same spot they were from the original mounting, then that could cause the engine to run lumpy, not start at all, or when it's under boost, not to run the correct boost.
On a Bugatti, almost right and actually right are two very different things, and the gap between them is expensive. The second option is to just repair the original part. It preserves the factory geometry, costs less, and removes the risk of machining something new and hoping it is accurate enough. The catch was that nobody actually knew whether the cast aluminum was even weldable. If it turned out it was not, that option disappeared immediately, and the problem got a lot harder. So Matt takes it to Bob at the machine shop. And this is genuinely one of the better moments in the whole series, because it is not presented like the answer is already guaranteed. It is a real test.
I got scared when I seen Mg, that means magnesium. If it's a high magnesium content, it won't weld very nicely or won't weld at all.
Yeah.
Bob checks the material, lines everything up carefully, and confirms it is weldable.
It's weldable. This is going to be mint. It's weldable.
which at this point in the rebuild feels like finding out you passed an exam you were convinced you had failed. Bob gets it welded up, Matt reinforces the weak areas on top of that, and the logic he uses is pretty straightforward. If the part is repaired properly and made stronger than it was before, it should not fail in the same place again. He says that openly.
That this weld will actually be stronger than the original cast material that it was made out of. So it won't break on this part again. But to take even more precaution, he's going to do something to make it even stronger.
He also raises something that is easy to overlook though. Strengthening this part might create a different problem entirely, because there is a real possibility Bugatti engineered it to be the weak point on purpose, designed to absorb and fail in a crash rather than letting the damage travel somewhere worse. Matt does not dismiss that idea. He just acknowledges that without factory support, he is the one deciding what risk is acceptable here, which when you think about it, is a pretty honest thing to admit out loud. And this also adds a nice little detail to that whole repair. Matt talks about Bob with the kind of trust you only have for somebody who has already saved you a dozen times before.
The guy that's done this is the most trustworthy guy.
Why? What makes him trustworthy?
In the world. He's never let us down. He works crazy hours and he is so autistic when it comes to metal.
And the repaired piece even gets its own little Eb Bob signature on it. On a rebuild like this, that is basically becoming part of the legend. Once the repaired mount goes back on, the whole project starts moving at a pace that feels almost surreal, given how stuck everything had been. Parts start going back where they belong, and Matt takes a moment to point out that the starter motor shares a part number with a pretty ordinary Volkswagen Group application.
The Volkswagen Passat starter motor. And some people have said online that there's no way that this is the 1.9 diesel starter motor. It is. It is the 1.9 TDI starter motor. It is. There's no difference.
A $2 million Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport, one of 60 ever made, and the starter motor is essentially a Volkswagen part with a much fancier address. Then comes the step that felt completely unthinkable just a few episodes ago. The front and rear halves of the car go back together. Matt makes the point himself that taking a car apart and putting it back together in a way that actually works are two very different things. The teardown gets the views, but the reassembly is where the project either proves itself or falls apart. Anyone can look at a Chiron in two pieces and be impressed. The real question is whether it can become a Chiron again. And then, just to keep things interesting, the rebuild manages to squeeze in one more problem. While torquing down the 14 fasteners joining the two halves, Matt snaps a bolt, having used the wrong torque figure for one of the differently sized ones tucked underneath.
Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Now we're in trouble.
The car is literally in the process of coming back together and still finds a way to cause chaos. He shows the mistake, gets the broken piece out, orders a replacement, and keeps moving. The car still gets back together, and at this point in the story, that is really all that matters. The new twist after that is the exhaust.
Here we go. The whole reason we took apart the back of this car because Alex wanted a new exhaust, and I agreed because I think it should have a new exhaust.
Since the rear is already apart, Matt and Alex decide this is the perfect time to experiment with a custom Valvetronic setup. It looks incredible, it gets fitted quickly, and for a moment it feels like the rebuild is about to reward everyone with some outrageous payoff. And then comes the moment the entire audience had been waiting for since episode 1. They get everything connected, the rear half of the car finally communicating with the front half again, and when they turn the key, the Bugatti starts. First attempt.
Whoa, it's starting on. It sounds pretty good. It sounds good.
On a car that had been split in half, had its engine mount welded back together in a machine shop, and had been completely taken apart and reassembled by a team that Bugatti publicly suggested should not be doing any of this. Matt and Alex both know this does not mean the car is finished or anywhere close to road ready, but what it does mean is that the rebuild has crossed from theory into reality. The repaired mount is holding, the electronics are talking to each other, and the engine is running. There is one funny extra beat here though. The custom exhaust does not transform the car in the way people probably expected. It is a bit louder, a bit deeper, maybe a little dirtier sounding. But it is not some night and day moment.
It sounds like a little bit louder, Yeah.
I expected like a different noise.
Yeah, I think it sounds the same, but louder.
Yeah.
If anything, the video ends up reinforcing the old truth that Bugattis are incredible machines, but not exactly the kings of exhaust noise. Then, roughly 3 seconds into celebrating, fuel starts leaking from underneath the car, because of course it does.
Good news, starts up, we fix the leak, it goes into gear. Bad news, Bugattis don't make a good sounding car.
This is the Bugatti rebuild. Nothing is allowed to go smoothly for more than a moment at a time. It turns out to be a fuel line that had simply popped off during reassembly rather than any kind of serious failure, so they sort it out, restart the car, and then get one more answer they had been quietly hoping for. The car goes into gear, which genuinely matters more than it might sound. Plenty of people watching this series had serious doubts the project would ever reach the point where the engine and gearbox were working together again as an actual functioning drivetrain. Now the car was running, selecting gear, and the whole conversation around the rebuild had started moving in a different direction. People were no longer just debating whether Matt should have attempted this. They were starting to talk about how much he had actually pulled off. But as good as that moment was, the rebuild is nowhere near finished, and the next set of problems are already lining up patiently in the queue. The most immediate one is the cooling system. Matt has been pretty upfront about the fact that they cannot properly evaluate the car until the front radiators are repaired. Coolant is actually in the system, and the engine is allowed to come up to proper operating temperature. The reason that matters so much is that Alex had driven the car without coolant at some point, which is the kind of detail that makes any mechanic visibly uncomfortable. If that damaged the water pump seals or anything else in the cooling system, the car is not going to tell you about it while it is sitting in a workshop idling for 2 minutes.
Alex drove this car a lot without any coolant in, and we've learned 10-15 minutes down the road with no coolant in his Hurricane that it burnt out a seal on his water pump and it leaked water.
It is going to tell you about it later, at the worst possible time, in the most inconvenient way possible. After that, the front of the car still has unresolved structural and body damage from the original crash, which means there is a significant amount of work still standing between this project and any kind of real road test. The rear may be alive and functioning, but the front is still a work in progress. And until that is sorted, the car is not going anywhere meaningful. And then there is the broader question of whether the car can actually live like a Bugatti again over time. Starting once in a workshop is one thing. Proving that the repaired systems do not throw codes, that the sensor positions are accurate enough, that the gearbox pressures behave correctly, and that nothing unexpected surfaces when the car gets properly hot is a completely different challenge. The online conversation has already shifted from people saying Matt would never get the car apart to people asking whether he can actually make it function like a Chiron Pur Sport in the real world, which is a much harder question to answer and probably the most important one left. And that is what makes this story more interesting now than it was at the start. The original drama was about whether Matt had the nerve to take on Bugatti at all. That argument has mostly run its course. What is left is less dramatic, but far more important. Heat, coolant, pressure, seals, front-end repairs, and the slow process of proving this is actually a real car again, rather than just a workshop project that happens to start and select gear. If Matt gets through all of that, this becomes one of the more remarkable independent hypercar repair stories anyone has attempted. If he hits a wall, the people who said this would eventually end up back at the Bugatti factory might still get the last word. Tuna No Crust, signing off.